Well, hey there, kiddos. Here is your video on solving with square roots. There is a disclaimer I need to give you, however. This is definitely easier than solving by factoring. However, this method only works whenever there is only a squared term. So you would just have an x squared and a number. If you have an x squared and then an x term and then a number, this method doesn't work. If you've got that middle term in your polynomial with an x on it, this won't work. But if you just have an x squared and a number, solving with square roots is the way to go. So to solve square roots by square roots, step number one, we want to get the squared term alone. So number one over here, we have x squared plus 5 equals 5. I want to get this x squared by itself, so I'm going to subtract 5 from both sides. And so I'm going to end up with x squared is equal to 0. Then it says to take the square root of both sides. So I'm going to take the square root of both sides, and if you have your calculator, you just hit second and then x squared. And so when you do that, you're going to get that x, because the square root of x squared is x, and the square root of 0 is just 0. And so x equals 0. Step 3 says not to forget the plus minus. I'll explain that in just a second, but for this problem, we don't need the plus minus because 0 is just 0. It doesn't have a sign, so we don't keep it. And then step 4 says to finish solving if necessary. Sometimes that's going to happen, and I'll do some examples like that. And then number 5 says you should have 2 answers. You won't always have a 2. Sometimes you'll have 1, but it'll be written with a plus minus, and that means it's going to be 2, which we'll talk about. But like this problem has 1 answer. So if you look at number 2 here, number 2 they took care of. The x squared term's already by itself, and so I'm just going to have to take the square root of both sides. So I'm going to take the square root of this and the square root of this. So square root of x squared is x. The square root of 225 is 15. And because I'm taking the square root, whenever you take the square root of a number, there are 2 possible answers. There's a positive answer and a negative answer. Because if I do 15 times 15, it makes 225. And if I do negative 15 times negative 15, I also get 225. So we're going to put this plus minus here to say that I have 2 answers, positive 15 and negative 15. So look at number 3. Number 3 is a little different because I've got 4x squared minus 25, and there's a lot happening. So the first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to get the squared term, the x squared, by itself. So I'm going to add 25 to both sides. So I'm going to get 4x squared equals 25. And then I'm going to have to divide by 4. Well, 25 does not divide by 4 into a nice pretty number. It makes a decimal. However, 25 is a perfect square. And 4 is also a perfect square. So I'm going to leave it as this fraction, and I'm going to go ahead and take the square root of both sides. And when I do, I'm going to have a fraction as an answer because I take the square root of the top and the bottom. And it's okay. So I'm going to end up with, I'm trying to find a space to write it, x is equal to, remember it's plus minus, the square root of 25 is 5, and the square root of 4 is 2. So it's plus or minus 5 over 2. So let's look at number 5. Number 5 is a little bit different because this is sort of looks like it's written in vertex form because I have this whole thing is squared. And so this counts as my squared term. This is what I want by itself, this thing in parentheses. So I'm going to have to divide by this 4 that's not in the parentheses to get the squared term alone. So I'm going to end up with x plus 2, the whole thing squared, is equal to 324 divided by 4 is 81. And now I can take the square root of both sides. And so I end up with x plus 2 is equal to plus or minus 9 because the square root of 81 is 9. Now here's where this gets tricky because now I have to finish solving. I want x by itself, but I have 2 answers here, positive 9 and negative 9. So what I really have is x plus 2 equals 9 and x plus 2 equals negative 9. And so to get my 2 solutions, I have to solve for x on both of them. So I'll subtract 2, so this gives me x is equal to 7. And when I subtract here, I get x is equal to negative 11. So my 2 solutions are x equals 7 and x equals negative 11. So number 7, I'm going to skip over here to number 7. I want the squared term all by itself, and it doesn't matter. I want this squared term all by itself. This is just written backwards. It's no big deal. But I still want the squared term by itself. So I'm going to start by subtracting 80. So I have negative 80 is equal to negative 2x squared. And so now I'm going to have to divide by -2. And when I do -80 divided by -2, I get 40. Positive 40 is equal to x squared. Well, now when I take the square root of both sides, 40 is not a perfect square. I can't, if I take the square root of 40, I'm going to get some weird decimal. And so I'm going to leave it as the square root of 40. And what I'm going to write is that x is equal to plus minus the square root of 40. And I'm just going to leave it under the radical symbol like that. I'm not going to actually figure out what it is, because the square root of 40 is going to be a 6 point some weird decimal. And I don't want to write all that down. I don't want to round, so we're just going to leave it the square root of 40. Tomorrow we'll talk about how to simplify the square roots and simplify it a little bit, but we're not. We're just going to leave it just like that. So this one last question about number 8, with the zookeeper buying a fence to enclose a pen at the zoo. The pen is an isosceles right triangle. There's already a fence on the side that borders a path. So there's already a fence over here. The area of the pen will be 4,500 square feet. The zookeeper can buy the fencing in whole feet only. How many feet of fencing should he buy? Well, he needs fencing for these two sides of the pen. So we're trying to find out x, and this is a triangle, and if you remember, area of a triangle happens to be base times height divided by 2. And so my base times my height for this problem happens to be x squared. So I'm going to end up with, because it's x times x. So I end up with x squared divided by 2 equals my area, which is 4,500. Well, the first thing that has to happen is I need this x squared all alone. So I'm going to have to multiply both sides of this by 2 to get rid of this fraction that I have. So I'm going to end up with x squared is equal to 9,000. Well, so to figure out what my x is, I'm going to take the square root of both sides. And so I'm going to get x is equal to, and if I do the square root of 9,000, it is not a real pretty number. It comes out to 94.868. And so on. So I have this decimal. I don't want to deal with the decimal. And so it says he can buy it in whole feet only, so we're going to have to round. And I'm going to have to figure out 94.868. If he buys only 94 feet, he won't have enough. What he's going to have to buy is 95 feet so that he has plenty. So we're going to call x 95. And we're not going to put the plus minus because the negative number doesn't make sense in this problem. You wouldn't buy negative feet of fence. You'd buy positive. So x is 95, but the question is how much should he buy? He's got to buy 95 feet here and 95 feet here, so I've got to multiply it by 2. So he should buy 190 feet of fence. That's how much he needs in order to finish off his pen at the zoo. So that's how we solve using square roots. We'll practice this when you guys come to class tomorrow. I'll see you then.